The sea lay like hammered iron under a winter moon, and the wind off it was a blade. Daenerys stood at the prow with a cloak of white wool wrapped twice around her shoulders and a third time for good measure. The fur collar pressed against her jaw, the guard of it crusted thin with frost where her breath had struck and frozen. Salt stung her lips. Her gloved hands curled on the rail until the leather creaked. Above, the dark shape of a dragon drifted, huge as a hill, wings moving with unhurried mercy. Its shadow slipped across the deck between the huddled figures of sailors and unsullied and Dothraki men in borrowed furs, and every head turned up, even those who had traveled months with these beasts and told themselves they were used to them. Drogon's eye caught a thread of moonlight and flashed like a coal in the sky. He tilted, rose, marked the bristle of masts beneath and the staggered line of their fleet pulling north along the cold curve of the world. "You look like you intend to outstare the horizon," Tyrion said behind her. He had a habit of stepping silently for a man who wore as many layers as he did. The heaps of fur made him a squat bear with a bright needle glance, his breath pluming steady as a small chimney. "It is a long way to stare," she said, "but the horizon keeps its promises. How dutiful of it." He rested his elbows on the rail and peered through the rime. "There are worse welcomes than a cold one. If they were burning the coast for miles, we'd be making other plans." Her mouth made a small curve that in kinder weather might have been a smile. "I have seen fires enough, and built a few," he murmured without censure. Then, more briskly, "Missandei says our stores will stretch with care. The Dothraki think the snow is ash that refuses to die. Most of them have never worn boots. I have never seen so many men glare at their own feet." She looked down the length of the ship at the clots of life gathered in the lee of anything that broke the wind, the curve of a catapult arm, the bulk of a stacked barrel, and there they were, her riders, their harebells silenced by leather wrappings and fur hoods. One had his hand under a snowflake, as if it were a bee that might sting him if he startled it. Another had gathered an armful of the stuff where the sea spray had piled it on a box lid, and now pressed it to his cheek and laughed. Steam rolled out of his mouth, and when he took his hand away the skin was red. They were learning to laugh at the cold to keep from cursing it. The fleet grumbled and clacked around them, timbers talking to timbers. The masts carried hard creases of ice where the spray had frozen while it flew. Rigging sang when wind rubbed it, a harp strung by a frigid god. Lanterns along the deck were hooded nearly closed. Their light made the frost shine and the men's eyes shine and the black water beyond more black for the comparison. The smell was a complicated thing. Tar and bitter rope, stale tallow, salt fish, the reptile warmth that tracked wherever her dragons went. She tipped her face up. Regal and Viserion had circled out of sight, roaming ahead. When they came back the air would thunder. Drogon dropped as if the world had tilted beneath him, the sudden descent of a boulder-grown wings. He flared, clawed at emptiness, sent a gust that rattled the rigging and made her cloak snap against her legs. He landed on the foredeck with a thump purely felt, like a second heartbeat arriving in the ribs. The sailors nearby swore and bowed and pretended they had not sworn. Drogon's talons clicked as he shifted to bring his head near her. He had grown in his growing, and there were places she did not know so well any longer. He breathed, long and even, and she felt the movement of it under her bone and glove, the lava in him content for the moment. "Tell him to be polite when we make our greeting," Tyrion said to her hand. "We want them to think us gracious neighbors, the kind who return borrowed sugar, the kind who bring their own." The thought of sugar, of anything that melted and tasted of summer, seemed as fanciful as a desert just now. "Is it close? By every chart I borrowed or stole, by every story of pilot and smuggler and soldier who ever had to make for harbor when they didn't want to, we are entering the Bight. White Harbor is the city in these parts, if such a word applies, where the cold takes what it wants and keeps it. They will have their lookouts. They might have had their lookouts for days. Dragons are not shy heralds. Nor are banners," Missandei said, appearing with the wind behind her so that it set a few bright threads of her hair adrift. She had wrapped herself in a coat that belonged to some captain's wife long dead, and sewn patches of felt inside it. Clever little pieces cut from old cloaks or coarse blankets, layer on layer. Her face was calm and, From time to time when she had to go up into the wind, closed as a fist. Our signals were seen. A light answered our agreed pattern last night from the shore. There were fires along the coast this morning as well, lit and hooded. The harbor will be ready. Ready to welcome or ready to weigh? Tyrion said. Ready to see what we are, Missandei said. And to decide. Grey Worm came a step behind her, tireless as always, the cold making no complaint allowed in him. He had exchanged his linen for leather and wool and armor padded to keep heat. The pale places that had been bare in warmer lands were hidden beneath fabric now. A scar ran along his jaw into the shadows. Had his eyes as he spoke. There was newness in them. He had passed through cities and deserts and more than one siege, and yet this was new. The white air blowing off a place none of them knew except in rumor. He did not say he feared the cold. He never spoke as men she had freed spoke, telling her their fears as if she might gather them in and set them aside. But she could sense where it lived in his breath and the way he kept his shoulders straight against it. We will not be supplicants, she said. We will be guests, and we will remember that guests can become invaders if they forget themselves. We have come to ask and to offer, not to take. Tyrion's mouth tipped. Then perhaps I will leave my purse aboard. You would be robbed in any weather, she said, and that made him show his teeth. It was good to see such small things. It meant they were still who they had been, despite the iron cold around them, despite the weight of wanting to arrive at some place that answered the ache in her signs and banners and blood with more than emptiness. She had told herself, when at last she had turned her fleet west, that she would land where the currents and the winds chose to grant easiest passage. She had learned enough of seas to know how little her will meant upon them. The winds had struck, harder north than she had imagined at first, storms shouldering them, the water like a city of glass buildings collapsing and rising again in pieces, months arranged into nights full of lightning and days full of a sky too flat to look at. In the lull of that long weather, the north had leaned across the map with a kind of inevitability. If she had turned for sunny southern ports, there would be old heavy names and older heavy hatred to sort. Here, there would be a newness, not gentleness, surely not, but something not yet arranged against her. The north remembered different wrongs. Dragons had come here once. A king of this land had bowed his head and kept his people. The story had been told around their galley tables, with wine where they had it and with freezing water when water was all, and men who had never in their lives thought to speak of such things had weighed in with learned certainty about what it meant to kneel or not kneel, about when a king was a fool and when he was brave. The arguments had warmed them when the braziers went out. She left the prow and let the cold close over the place where she had stood. She walked past lanterns where moths that must have been born of some madness fluttered dumbly around the heat. She walked past bales covered in oiled cloth and the bundled curves of ballista arms, past the barrel where a woman boiled something that made the air smell of roots and bitterness, and children huddled with their backs to the barrel and grinned at her because their teeth did not yet ache from the cold as their parents did. She put a hand to one child's head as she passed, feeling hair clean as river grass, Missandei's work, because Missandei talked to the women, finding ways for them to own this voyage as something other than their men's decision. When she reached the quarterdeck, the captain pointed with a gloved hand, twice, the gesture big so that even those who did not understand every word of a northern tongue could read it. There at last the first lights that could not be mistaken for stars. They were low on the horizon and steady and arranged in a pattern that could only be men's will made visible. A lantern at a certain height above the water, a sequence of 3 pale gleams, then a red one, a long sweep of darkness and then a crown of light at the mouth of a river where ice ground in its channel. White Harbor rose out of the night as their eyes adjusted. It was not a beautiful city in the way of southern ports with their copper domes and fat green palms. It was a strong city made where a brown river met a hard sea. Layers of stone ratcheted up the hill to a castle not so grand as some but planted there with a confidence that despised ornament. The lighthouse watched them, its flames still behind its hood. Down along the lower town, buildings huddled like beasts making shelter together. The smell changed as they neared, land coming up under salt. Cold mud, old wood, a sweetness that might be the faint remains of stored apples. Fish, of course, and smoke of driftwood and peat both. In places the white knife had put a skin on itself that would bear a man's weight. In other places the current tore that skin to ribbons and sent them banging together like plates in a clumsy kitchen. Boats went down.
Robson.
People spoke through mufflers and with hands, and the sea clutched at each hull because it hated to give up what it held. Daenerys sent Missandei and Grey Worm in the first boat with a banner, not all her names but a simple white field with a red three-headed dragon upon it. She watched that dragon reflection move across the water like a wound. Tyrion, one of them reached and caught Missandei's hand when she climbed, and the two of them paused, connected by a moment's surprise. Daenerys could feel the prickle at the back of her neck that came whenever she was about to be judged by eyes that had not expected her. She thought of the first time she had walked the burned lanes of Astapor with people peering from behind shutters that had fallen off their hinges. It had always been like this and would always be, her face throwing different kinds of light on different streets. A boy ran from the harbor gate, a thin shape in a cloak too long for him so that he held it in one hand. He vanished into the city and she imagined the courses beneath. Lanes named since the first stones were laid. The market squares where people grew reluctant to gather when frost hailed down. The stairs where cousins had paused 100 years ago to argue if a marriage should happen and the ghost of that argument still clung to the stone. And a tower where a lord waited to hear that a woman was at his gates with monsters that flew. "Would you like to rehearse your speech?" Tyrion asked, mild. "I would like to say what is true. That is a dangerous habit. Do not let me break you of it." "What would you have me say then?" He considered. "Say that you come with fire in a place that believes in ice. Say that you have crossed more than half the world because you have learned how far the world can go wrong, and you intend to bend it back to the line it should have. Say that you are tired of being told to wait. That last might be the most persuasive." She looked sideways at him. "For lords. For people. Most of us spend our lives waiting for those above to stop arguing." He made a small, careful bow, ceding the thought back to her as if it were a knife he dared not carry. She did not pretend she did not know how to carry knives. She had been taught their shapes since the day her brother had looked at her and seen coin first and blood after. A bell on the seawall told once, then once more. A man raised a hand. Tyrion sent the signal back across their own deck. The boat was coming for them. She climbed down into it with the ease of practice, felt the shock of cold water spray against her boot when the boat dipped. Drogon rumbled at that, unhappy when she stepped away from him. He would not fit through the harbor gate without making their visit an assault. He rose instead, circling, his shadow skating across the city front. Men on the wall shifted, and she tasted their fear as if it were metallic in the air. Regal and Viserion wheeled higher, making the lighthouse flame wink as their wings crossed its beam. The oarsmen took them in. Missandei turned from where she had been speaking with the harbormen, her face made even and clear for the moment of presentation. "My queen," she said. "This is Ser Marlon Manderly, whose lord bids you welcome." Ser Marlon inclined his head deeply, cautious and thoughtful movements of a man who knows far more of tides than of court beaux. His cheeks were ruddy with cold and broken veins. His eyes were bay-colored and as frank as a dog's. "My lord is my cousin," he said. "Lord Wyman Manderly of the New Castle. He sends me to say you shall find food and fire and beds. He also asks that your dragons rest upon the shore beyond the walls until he has had speech with you." Daenerys heard the ring around that last sentence where it had been shaped by long care. The request was not a request. It was not a refusal, either. It was a test. Could she be asked and would she answer? "They will roost where I bid them," she said. "If it eases your people, they will roost on the strand. They hunt the sea as well as they hunt the sky. Fewer things burn there that ought not to." Ser Marlon's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Fewer things burn on the water," he agreed. "If you will come, my queen. Mines grow stiff when they are not warmed, and my lord has waited long hours." They went in beneath an arch of wet stone that smelled of old weed and iron. The harbor opened like an empty bowl that somebody had set on a white tablecloth and filled with black. Ropes frosted. Oars knocked ice off their own blades when they rose and out of habit dipped them too quickly again. Men on the quays held poles and pushed slow flows away. They tucked the boat between two moorings where old lines had worn their grooves into stone and ladders had grown sea-slick. Daenerys went up and felt the bite of the rungs through her boot soles like teeth. The city gathered as cities always do for news that comes by water. Faces appeared in the tight alleys between warehouses. Women with baskets stood as if the baskets had grown heavier at the sight of her. Boys craned around corners. An old man with a wheelbarrow leaned on its handles, one mitten dangling loose by its cord. All of them were made heavier by winter. They carried wood on their backs. They carried worries like wood. Some of them had eyes that had kept more hope than was sensible. She hated that she had grown used to that look, as if hope were a kind of tax simpler to collect than coin. Two girls stood at the edge of the godswood that here was not a grove but a wedge of space where buildings had not crowded out a small clutch of trees, their trunks dark and smooth. Snow balanced on the black twigs as if it were waiting to choose which way to fall. The girls had their skirts tucked into their belts so they would not drag and soak. Their legs were wrapped in many layers of wool and their boots were patched with more care than she had paid for any of her own footwear before she had known what it was to own anything. One girl, her jaw firm, her eyes green as the sea looks when it is shallow over sand, stood with a steadiness that made Daenerys think she was somebody's daughter whose name mattered. The younger, who might have been her sister, had a small stone cupped in her palm. Children held the strangest treasures. "Lady Winifred," Ser Marlon said over his shoulder, regret shading his acknowledgement of his own bow. The girl with the eyes dipped her chin and watched Dean. Ares watch her. No fear. Plenty of calculation and a strip of curiosity that was not unkind. "Lady Willa," Ser Marlon said to the child with the stone, and the little one flashed her teeth. Old blood moved under their patched cloaks. Daenerys felt the neighborhood of it like a hearth catching. She followed where the lamps led. The new castle had earned its name once and kept it out of habit. It rose in plains of pale stone still fair where the wind could wash it, pocked with lichen where wind could not reach. The gate was iron that wore a film of white like breath. Men in the colors of the Manderley house stood too deep within. They held their spears as if the wood warmed their hands. A standard hung unmoving in the cold, the merman swallowing the sea and yet drowned by it. Another riddle of a place that took its life from a thing that killed. The hall was warm. It was a brutal, glorious mercy to step into it and feel the sting on the face and hands when cold fled and left all the blood to come back, demanding attention. Fires banked in 3 big pits set with iron grates. Banners hung like skins around the room where drafts could not make them move. Benches. A table with a map scraped into it under glass. The glass fogged now with the breathing of men who had stood there speculating all day about what she might be. Servants moved quickly, quiet as winter mice. Their breath stamped itself on the air and vanished. A boy tripped and did not quite fall and shot a look up to see if any power had seen him. Lord Wyman Manderley sat not on a throne, which would have made him a figure, but on a chair that admitted the fact of his body. He was a large man in a land where large meant something. He had a face that might have been kind if it had not been busy doing sums most of the time. The fat of him did not distract from the muscle of him. The old strength that had set nets and lifted catches and chosen which man would have the last loaf right at the point where that choice made enemies. He rose when she came up the center of the hall and bowed, carefully as if he had considered all the angles. "My lady," he said, "my men tell me you are a queen. I do not have the habit of seeing queens at my gates. I do not have the habit of finding welcome where I am not yet known," she answered. "But I have grown fond of ways that are not habit." Wyman smiled quickly. "One could live on little like that for a very long winter. You bring dragons. My grandson says that is indisputable." My windows shook. The pigeons in my loft threw themselves against the walls in a panic. His exact words. He gestured with a hand and a servant ran lightly to add another log to the nearest fire. "We have not had such visitors since the first men with wings came and asked whether we liked the arrangement of our little homes." "I am not here to arrange your homes," she said. "I am here to ask you to speak to me as a man who knows his land. My counsel says this: the North is hurt and proud and beset. I have no wish to put my shoe upon its throat and demand its breath. I have come because there is a danger beyond thrones and coin. I have come because I was born with the means to answer that danger, and I would not live with myself if I did not try." He looked at her long enough that a lesser woman might have turned her face aside. He had the eyes of a fisherman calculating whether a black line at the horizon is a storm or a shoal of fish. "The tales of the dead that walk have been told again this winter with more fear than usual," he said at last, as if they were speaking of whether a bridge would bear a certain weight or of the price of grain, matters substantial and dull. "Cold changes the measure of men. It changes the measure of everything. I have kin on the road to the wall. I have men who will not return from hunting. Wolves grow braver when ice is thick, and there are worse hungry things than wolves. The North is a pragmatic creature, Your Grace. It does not shake at ghosts easily. When it shakes, I mind that shake. I have fire," she said, "and not for men's houses." He held her a moment longer and then nodded, once, as if two columns on a ledger had balanced. "Eat," he said. "You have come a long way with big teeth over your head and a lot of sailors who would like to be sailors again in whatever passes for a spring for this place. Eat and I will speak, and after I have spoken, you will speak, and we will see if the talking adds up to something that will not break the city. Sir Marlin, be a good cousin and tell my kitchen to remember salt." She ate because it would have been foolish to refuse and foolish to pretend she did not need the food. Lamprey pie, rich and black with pepper. Oat bread slashed with a pattern that looked like the river branches of the white knife. The last of the autumn apples, wrinkled at the skin but still sharp when teeth bit them, the scent like a memory of a room heated by the low sun. The Dothraki men eyed the pie suspiciously, but in the end ate a great deal of it and learned to wipe the grease with hunks of bread. The Unsullied ate as they always did, efficiently, without complaint. Tyrion drank his wine slowly enough that he could still count, and smiled at the appropriate moments, and stored every face and reaction in the cramped attic of his mind. While the plates were still being changed out, Wyman lifted a hand. Conversation in the hall stepped back to make room. "I have lived long enough to watch the tide come in on men who promised a lot," he said. "I have watched it go out on them as well. I have seen promises like the whalebone ribs we use in our rafters, long and strong and then broken by weather too proud to accept that something lived here once and still holds up the roof. You say there is an enemy in the dark beyond the wall. Everyone with any sense says there is an enemy in Winterfell as well. You will have noticed the banners along the road as you came in, where they are and where they are not. I am not Ned Stark. I have not spent my life being told I am a good man so often that I might even have believed it. I am a man with a city to keep fed, a harbor to keep open, and in the end I am this, a steward for a time until they put me under stones and someone else takes the chair. I am not here to tell you how to be good," Daenerys said. "I am here to ask whether you would turn your ships toward a war that is not the one you expected." He tasted those words like bread to see if it had gone sour. "My ships are meant to come and go with fish and with jars of thing that make fish sweeter and with men who like to gamble," he said, smiling almost despite himself. "I have a score with some houses I do not name here. If you had led with the salted goat, you would have owned us sooner. So, we will make arrangements that will make some men curse us and some men call us wise, which is how you know they are about equal. You will keep your dragons from frightening my fishermen into falling off their boats. You will send your cleverest people to talk with my cleverest people, and we will see how much fire warms without burning." Missandei stepped forward with a slate and a bit of chalk and the quick, lucid light in her face that Daenerys had. "I am one of them," he said, and watched her watch his mouth and his eyes and his hands and everything else that men tried not to let women see. "I am the one who pays attention when I can afford it and drinks when I cannot. My lady will be a good guest if you are a good guest," she said. "You know that. I know that people want to be able to tell a story about what the future will be. I know that a dragon on a roof makes it harder to tell that story with a straight voice. I also know that there are things coming down out of the north that don't care for our stories." She glanced sideways at the windows where frost had drawn its ferns. "My aunt says she saw lights last night that were not your dragons. She says the air was full of a sound that did not belong to anything alive. My aunt has told stories before that were not true, but sometimes they are. Tyrion drank the last of his wine and let the heat of it settle around the cold at his core, which had learned in the last months to be patient. "I will give you another story to tell then," he said. "Once upon a time a queen came with fire and was careful. It does not end in a hurry. That's the best kind. In the morning she walked the lower town with Missandei because there was no point in being a queen in a hall if her face did not show in the places where men lay down their backs to labor and women stooped to keep water from freezing in their pails. The streets were packed snow and ash, snow and straw, snow and the softened rot of things that had saved someone's life a week ago and now had to go somewhere. Doors sagged under the weight of their own chill. Men hammered nails with gloves on. They did it better than the Southerners she had known did with warm hands. The river breathed out a cold that had shape and a sour dampness in it. The noise was of sledges on runners, the steady scrape, the clatter when a strap slipped and the load came off and men cursed and then laughed because cursing made little heat. She kept her hands visible and closed her cloak enough that people knew she felt what they felt. She touched when she should, children most easily, but also old men with cheeks like dried apples and women who looked at her and saw something of their own hunger and desire to be more than how much they had to carry. She bought a wool cap from a man whose eyebrows had frozen together in a point. She paid twice what it was worth and gave it to a boy whose ears were red raw. She took from Missandei a bag of small coins and passed them without looking like alms. It had always worked better to make money seem to pass as if it were the moving of a ledger dispute than a gift with pity clinging to it. The Dothraki found them there. 2 of them, boys really, though they had braided hair heavy with bells that had rung in warmer camps and grew quiet here. They rode ponies that looked insulted by the cold and wore hides that had once been blankets for brood mares. One of the boys held out his hand. It shook. He had lost feeling in his fingertips and wanted to show his queen without saying it aloud. "Wrap them," she said, and took his hand in her own, despite his flinch, and blew on it as a mother blows on soup to make it less dangerous. She flexed his fingers. Move them when you don't have to. When you are not riding, put your hands in your armpits. Your blood will move if you make it. Do not let it decide to stop." He nodded, eyes dropped. He was ashamed to be cold. It was a stupid thing to be ashamed of, and it would kill him if she did not make him stop being ashamed. Grey Worm appeared an instant later as if summoned by need. He took the boy's hand as well and showed him the cloth strips under his own gauntlets and how they were wrapped. How they could be unwrapped and wrapped again even with clumsy hands and with the wind impatient. Missandei spoke to the woman who stood watching the exchange from behind a cauldron where something boiled in a treasonous way, the smell of meat in a thin broth. Her hair was caught up in a net with bits of shell sewn into it, not pretty so much as determinately different from the dead season. Missandei always, somehow, found the right words to make strangers tell her what she needed to know, whether she said those words in High Valyrian or in the thick roll of a tongue that had learned to keep its jaw out of the wind. This time she returned with information that looked like a list and smelled like the river. "They have salt," she said. "They will have less timber if this winter lasts longer. They will have too many bodies to put in the ground if the ground does not open, and they do not burn their dead." Daenerys thought of dragons, and for once not with hunger in her chest. "We will see to that," she said, quietly, "after dark." Missandei nodded and tightened her scarf. "And there is one more thing," she said. "There was an envoy from Winterfell 3 days ago. He spoke to Lord Wyman, and to men who do not admit to serving Lord Wyman but serve him still. He will come again when word has reached him that you are here." "What did he ask?" "To whom the city belongs," Missandei said, as if that is a question with a simple answer. Daenerys lifted her face. It was snowing again, dry little needles. It filled the hollows of the city's stone and made the world soft where it had been all edges. The dragons were somewhere overhead. She could feel them as pressure at the base of her skull, almost like the headache that had dogged her these last weeks when the wind changed. She wondered if Regal had found seals. He liked the way fat burned. He would be sleek tonight, for once satisfied. Viserion liked fish enough, and the hot gust of his breath would make the spray curtain off the water and freeze there again and turn the rocks to glass. Drogon would range as far as the land let him and then farther if he desired. She would have to call him down at dusk. On the second day, a raven came to the new castle with its legs wrapped in a leather band that held a piece of rawhide on which someone had carefully printed letters as if he were making stitches in a wound. The bird shook frost out of its feathers and drank water with the distracted eagerness of all creatures that know water in winter is a brief kindness. The message said only this: "Someone has seen your dragons. If you have business with the wall, you would be heard." It was signed by a steward whose name was a plain thing and whose effort to make the letters even had failed in a way that made Daenerys feel a ridiculous affection for him. "Jon Snow will have seen to this," Tyrion said. He had men who were better at words than he was. He had a habit of choosing the right men for things he could not do himself. That made him dangerous. "You respect him," she said. "I try to respect all serious men," he said. "He is serious without being grave. There's a difference. He might even be a man who could see a dragon in the sky and think first of the wind. Is he a king? We invent those as needed." Tyrion's mouth twitched. "In the north, they are more careful about it. They will not call a man a king merely because he has a hat and a sword. They will call him a king because his sheep do not disappear and his house does not fall down when the thaw comes and the river tries to get into the cellar. Then I will see him. Not before you are sure the city will not starve a week quicker because you have taken what it needed to last too." He pointed without looking to where Missandei had made a kind of camp on the floor of the great hall with chalk marks and a slate and a half-dozen northern clerks comparing numbers until their noses ran. It is the dullest part of being a queen. It is also the part that keeps people alive long enough for the bright parts. She laughed then, quick and true, and some men turned to see where the sound had come from, hunger rising in their faces like something with a scent. She would not be mean with laughter. There was too little of it in winter. At dusk He rode with Grey Worm and a handful of Dothraki and as many Manderly men as Ser Marlin would lend, out through the gate that faced the sea. They took the strand where the river opened into the harbor, and then the sea took the river and made it something fierce and without a name. The shore here was strewn with driftwood torn up from places that thought they were safe, and bent iron from old traps, and the white bones of whales long dead, and now used to shelter small sheep whenever there were small sheep to be sheltered. The air bit and kept biting, and then a kind of numbness came over the bites, and they became something stylized, like the shapes on a banner. She called to the dragons, and they came out of the dark like mistakes corrected. Drogon first as always, a wall of heat, stone and tempered air and pride. Regal hunting low, his belly almost brushing the surface of the water so his claws cut it as if it were silk. Viserion above them both like a thought no one had had yet. His cry something like laughter, or like a nail drawn along the edge of a cup. She climbed Drogon with the ease of a woman who has burned for this and who knows. She always knew, so deep it lived beyond knowing, that he would not throw her. His scales had snow between them. She brushed it away and it melted and steamed and left him modish in patches as if he wore lace. He snorted at that indignity. She patted him with a gloved hand and felt the way the heat made the glove less necessary a moment at a time. They did not fly far. She did not want to show the city a display. She wanted to show it resolve. They went up in a slow circle so that any child who had told his mother that he had seen dragons would now be believed. They crossed the harbor mouth and let the lighthouse flame roll across their bellies. They saw the boats hidden in the lee of a cove whose existence the official maps did not admit. She watched people on the seawall stop pretending to do their work and simply gape, an entirely human act that made her fond of them. She thought of the way the stories would be told tonight in bed, in the low briquette houses where the walls leaked cold. A man's voice going serious, careful with magic. A child's voice imitating the cry of a beast it would rather love than fear. They did not light much in that circuit. A sucking bed of marsh at the edge of the strand that had taken too many cattle in the last week. She let Drogon heat it until the treacherous skin buckled and the mud beneath steamed and then hardened into something honest. A tower of bone that might fall in a wind and bring down on some fishing hut one more bad luck. She had Viserion set that bone to light and watched it blaze white and then collapse in on itself in charred stubs that no one could mistake for shelter. When she came down again, a northern woman with her hands in her apron and her hair wrapped in a strip of cloth that had once been a banner said, "Well," in the kind of tone that made the word carry the weight of having admitted something. "They aren't only for show then, your pets." "They are not pets." the Dothraki boy said, startled into indignation. They are hungry, Daenerys said, cutting him and herself both away from the old words. And mine, that seemed to satisfy the woman, whose eyes darted to the shadow of men at the edge of the strand and then beyond to where the marsh might still eat the unwary. Happen you'd let one of them look up the river a bit, she said, and then colored as if she had spoken out of turn. There's a beast been watching, couple of days, doesn't steal yet, learns, I taste it, on my back. She did not ask for proof. She had learned the shapes of truth in many tongues. She sent Regal with a thought and a sound she made low in her throat, a sound that had never been taught her by men but by those quick, deep eyes and the weight of the air under his wings when he stooped. A quarter of an hour later, he came back with blood black in the cold on his mouth and the half-chewed arm of something that had too many joints for any honest creature born of the warm world. The Manderly men crossed themselves or caught at old gods invisible by habit. Grey Worm looked to her face before he let anything about his own change. The message from Winterfell came on the third day. It was not a raven. It was a man, and another behind him with a standard rolled up and bound with a cord. They wore the sigil of a flayed man on their coats, as if a badge confessed sin honestly and so might be forgiven. They were pale as men who slept with the windows open and did not do it out of courage. They asked for a courtesy audience. Ser Marlin stood beside them at the door and performed the sort of civilities that could be phrased later as having behaved like an honorable host if anyone tried to censure him. Daenerys sat in the hall again with fewer fires this time, not because she wanted to lower them, but because Wyman Manderly had caught her by the sleeve like a father speaking to a daughter. He intended to see through the winter and said, "If you please, your grace, it would be politic to let the city see that warmth is rationed. Not your warmth, the other kind." She had nodded at once because this was what it was to come into a place that did not belong to you and try to live in it. 100 small obediences that added up to respect. The Bolton's man had learned to make his voice smooth. His shoes were damp at the toes. Someone had taken pity on him out in the courtyard and led him to warmth there, while the message was delivered up the chain of people who were deciding how quickly the message should come to her. He made the gestures of a man who lives in fear. He made them automatically like a man who breathes. It had the effect of making, "Why Lord says that Winterfell has room for your people, if they are hungry, and for you as well. He asks for the courtesy of your presence to discuss how best to share the burdens that winter brings." In this hall, the words shared and winter sat together like a bad marriage. She could feel men drawing breath to swallow down laughter that wanted to be anger. The Dothraki boy at her right hand, who had learned to hold a spear in a fashion the Northerners did not mock, shifted his foot and the bells in his hair made the smallest note. "Your lord has a reputation," Daenerys said. "I have heard it sung in cities he has never seen." The man's mouth did something like a smile. "Winter, my lady, makes tyrants seem larger than they are. Winter makes truth sharper," she said. "I will not come to Winterfell to be weighed in a scale I do not trust." The man swallowed. His Adam's apple lifted a moment and then fell. "Then my lord asks that you remain a guest of Lord Wyman, with whose good judgment he has no quarrel, and 2 days from now he will send an escort so that your retinue may be shown the courtesies due strangers of standing in this country. There has been some disorder along the roads. Our banner is a strong statement against disorder." A hiss nearly escaped the room and had to be smothered under the hand of every person present who knew what the phrase had called a strong statement when they were pretending their knives made the world peaceful. Wyman Manderly made a sound in his throat that men who had served him for 30 years had never heard before and would not speak of afterward. "You may tell your lord that I will not be escorted by symbols of fear," Daenerys said. She kept her voice level, almost soft, warm enough to drink if a man could lift the cup to his lips without shaking. "You may tell him he may come himself, if he wishes, to White Harbor. If he does not, I will remember that." It was not a threat. It arrived as a promise. The man bowed, because some of the old courtesies still had power, and because a room full of men who had pulled her boats to shore and eaten bread from her hand were watching him with the kind of attention that seeks excuses. When he was gone, the hall let itself breathe. Wyman rubbed the bridge of his nose. "He will not come," he said. He does not like cities where his friends' men are not the ones who take the coin on the gate. And besides, he thinks the world has settled into his hand. Why would a man cross a river when he believes the river is already laced to his boot? Because he has forgotten that ice can break, Tyrion said. It is a common mistake. Then we will not make it, Wyman said, and that was all, although there was something like joy under his words, very small and very stubborn, as if the harbor had shifted just enough to keep a boat from cracking on a hidden rock. News moved on its own legs. Stories grew as they crossed streets. Late that night, a woman knocked on the door of a storehouse where Dothraki boys had been learning to knot ropes with gloves on. She had a baby wrapped up so thoroughly it might have been a loaf. Her breath sawed. She did not ask for money, and she did not ask for food, and she did not ask for their queen. She asked for heat because there was a body in the back room that had been a man 2 days ago and now was frozen too hard to carry, and if it lay under the bed 1 more hour, the baby would breathe in the death and learn to think it was air. Daenerys went. She took Missandei and Grey Worm and 2 of the Unsullied, who had been children in a city where men did not bury their dead when plague took them because there were no corners left to dig and the ground had refused. She took Viserion as well because he was the gentlest and because his flame could be measured when she asked it to be. They went in the back way past the midden and over a fence made from the broken ribs of a ship. There the family had set up the room in which they had lived for 20 winters with their backs against each other and their feet toward the hearth. It was wrong to be in such a space with strangers, wrong, and yet the wrongness now was that a man lay with his eyes wide open and white and his mouth careful as if he had something to say but had forgotten the words. She had Viserion lay his fire at the far end of the room. He did not roar. He breathed. The flame ran red gold along the wall, and then it crept like sunlight at morning over old boards and the dusty curtains and the iron pot. The frost lifted off the floor a hand's breadth at a time, and the color came into the baby's face as if someone had been painting it carefully and had just found the pink. They did not teach the child to fear the dragon. They did not teach it not to fear the dragon either. They would have time for 1,000 lessons, if luck did not prove stingy. In the morning, a boy in the harbor godswood was teaching a Dothraki how to use a pole to test the ice. The boy had a missing finger. He looked at the stump without shame. He was showing the man where to prod and how to listen. The Dothraki was showing the boy how to stand so a fall would not take the breath out of him and make him drown even if he did not fall through. They laughed when they got it wrong, and the laugh did not sound like an apology. It sounded like 2 kinds of stubbornness discovering they were cousins. A week passed in the strict time that cities measure, bells and meals and the hour when lamps must be trimmed and the smell of a bread oven when it is pleased with itself. Under that time, a slower time moved, the time of strangers starting to fit or refusing to, of hard words becoming the words a man says to himself when he is not thinking about the person they are meant to hit, of children remembering which names go with which grammar, of dragons choosing where to sleep. Regal favored the ice floes. He liked to warm them until they cracked and then leap to the next. As if playing a game he refused to explain. Viserion liked the lighthouse because men kept their hand about it and he liked to lean into that hand. Drogon sprawled on the strand beyond the city and made gulls mad. When the tide came in, he let it lick his tail as if he took the sea's insolence as a compliment and would therefore not answer it with fury. One morning he stood with her on the lighthouse gallery with his head at the level of her chest. His eye a whole world of dark and red and a yellow line that might have been a horizon if it were not so alive. The wind on that height had knives in it. White Harbor lay below them like a schema on paper, its lanes too orderly from this distance, the people ants with smoke. You knew this part would be slow, Tyrion said, coming up behind her as if he had been invited to share everything. You knew it and you hate it as much as anyone does. I do not hate it, she said. I hate that I like it. I hate that it feels like safety when we are not safe. He considered that. There have been worse vices than enjoying the part of rule where people do not cut each other without thinking. The trick is to keep track of the knives without jabbing yourself. She put her gloved hand on Drogon's snout. He closed his eyes slowly, as men do when a hand brushes hair off their forehead. He tastes something, she said. The sea, the air behind the sea. She followed the line of the coast. Far out there the world broke itself against rocks called with names old as fear. Beyond that broke between two fingers of ice that sent their cold down into these waters like rumor. Beyond that the night to which men had gone and not come back. If there are dead men walking on the snow, what do they taste like on a dragon's tongue? Mistake and hunger, I suppose, Tyrion said. Most terrible things taste like that. Some of the gentle ones as well. A horn sounded from the watch on the north road. One long note that meant travelers, not raiders, and the tone of the horn said the men who blew it had not decided whether to be glad or troubled. The sound reached the lighthouse and came into her bones the way cold did. It made the dragons lift their heads together, as if they had heard a language too quiet for men. Jon Snow rode into White Harbor that afternoon with a handful of men in black cloaks hardened with frost, and an enormous white wolf who did not keep his distance as well as men did. He did not ride like a king. Too much patience in the way he sat, the reflex to make way for other lives. He was careful with his courtesies to Wyman Manderley. He was deferential to Missandei without making a show of it, a rare thing for men who arrive with an understanding that a hall will wish to please them. He stared at the dragons for the length of a single breath and then went on with the business of being a man who has walked inside the wind at the top of the world and knows that drama is a luxury. Daenerys watched him cross the floor to her with the wolf at his heel and a stiffness in his left hand that spoke of bad healing. He was not the man she would have chosen to meet first if she had been able to choose a man. She would have chosen someone easy to place, his loyalties printed on his face like a map. This man wore his private weather like a cloak, and she liked him for it before she could stop herself. "My lady," he said. "There are times when the word queen is a weapon," she said. "I would rather we did not injure each other with it today. Then we can save our weapons for the things that do not bleed like we do." The wolf's eyes were red as embers. He did not make a sound. He simply stood and breathed and made the hair lift along every northerner's neck with the knowledge that a creature that had been built for a much older world was standing and breathing beside them and seemed content with it. She did not pretend at small talk, and he did not pretend either. They stood beside the table with the map under glass. It had been annotated and corrected in chalk by Missandei's hand. The chalk sat in a little wooden tray, stained by many fingers. Jon Snow put one finger on a line and left no mark because he knew his hands were cold enough to shatter if he pressed too hard. "I have read what I can read about your way north," she said. "I have spoken to men who say things and to men who say nothing and allow their faces to say things for them. I have listened to a woman who has eyes that have seen the far distances that make men jealous to remember them. None of it is enough. It will not be enough until the dead come to the edge of the city," he said. "I would prefer not to let them make the point for me." She looked beyond him at the men in black. Their hair had frost braided into it. Their beards were rimed with salt from their own breath. Their coats were patched end over end. They were serious without being grave, as Tyrion had said, and that was a strange courage. "What do you need?" she asked. "Not kneeling," he said, too fast, then caught himself and a faint embarrassment moved under his skin like a fish under ice. "We will sort the kneeling later, when we are arguing about beds and blankets and who has the right to sit at the end of the table where the light falls on his cup." Tyrion coughed something that might have been a laugh if it were allowed to be. It was not here. Here there were manners clinging to fear. "What do you need?" she asked again, and this time found she meant it with a fierceness that surprised her, as if she had come here to be necessary to this man and only now recognized it. "Dragons," he said, "and a promise." "Those are two different sizes," she said. "The dragons will make the promise worth hearing, and the promise will make the dragons worth fearing." They looked at each other a moment across that old arithmetic. He had the temper of a man who knows that if he shouts in the wind it will be stolen. Add the temper of a woman who knows that if she does not shout in the wind, the men behind her will forget she is there. It was a problem for later, like everything human and intricate. "Tell me," she said, "what you have seen." He did not tell it like a song. He set it down like stone and then another stone. He spoke of ice that did not behave as ice should. He spoke of dead men who wanted life the way starving men want bread, without sense. He spoke of nights when the aurora over the north had been too bright and the men had dreamt of wide white beaches and voices that insisted that warmth was a kind of lie. He spoke of the way the living became careless with their own breath when they were close to such things, and of how the careless died without noticing they had agreed to it. She listened without flinching. She had been told stories in many places. This was the first time she had felt that she sat at the edge of a story that had built itself out of human lives for 1,000 years and was only now tired of writing in hints. When he was finished, she set her hand flat on the glass over the map, where the chalk had dragged as if it were a snake. I have the means. I do not yet have the right. The dead will not ask to see your papers, he said. No, but the living must. Else I have only fire, and I have learned how little a life that is. Jon Snow's mouth ticked, a tiny permission for something like humor to approach their conversation without being devoured. We will teach you the wall, he said. You will teach us how to move one of your creatures without making it angry. We will send men to walk with your soldiers on the ice. We will send ravens, and for once when they go out from the wall with news, they will carry something that is not one more notice of a dead man's son. Wyman Manderley cleared his throat. And I will stand here and add up in my head how many of the people who need bread next month may be convinced that neighbors are worth more than old debts, he said. Perhaps I will keep a tally. You are a very northern man, Tyrion said amiably, which for him was to indicate a great compliment. Men starve when they are not, Wyman said. They set a time and an arrangement that pleased no one completely and therefore had the chance of being fair. Jon Snow would return to the wall with 2 of her dragons, and with her permission for a 3rd to follow when it was needed. She would keep one. It would not be Drogon. She could have argued. Instead, she surprised herself and did not. She felt the thought pass through him when he realized what she had let go. It was not gratitude, not exactly. It was the knowledge that she would do what men thought she would not, and that thought made him readjust everything. In the courtyard, the wolf walked near Drogon and did not lower his eyes. Drogon considered this very carefully and shifted his weight so that the weight of him moved the ground a little under all of them, and then lifted his head and snorted as if to say that he was in a mood to allow things that would not be allowed on other days. Ghost. Someone had said the name and it had been carried on a breath that smoked. Looked at Daenerys then, directly, with the simplest bright attention, and she had the indecent feeling that an old creature had looked at her and found her not altogether foolish. When the time came for Jon Snow to ride out again, the city gathered in the lazy manner it had developed for gathering. Men wandering toward the gate with a pretext in their hands. Women standing in doorways. Children already on the fence. The sound of it was a fitful hum that reminded Daenerys of bees in a hive that had been knocked by a careless foot and was undecided whether to be angry or industrious about it. She stood with Missandei and Wyman Manderley and the 2 Manderley girls and watched the preparations. The men in black check straps with a care that had no noise in it. They moved their mouths over private lists. They tightened the wraps on their hands. Grey Worm walked along the line and gave each man a patch sewn from a piece of cloth all the same blue. The blue from the flag that had flown over the quarterdeck of her largest ship when she had left a hot port where the smell of ripe fruit had made everything easier than it now was. The patch was nothing and also everything. It made the men touch their own chests as if they had to remind their hearts of something. Can you hold your breath? Jon Snow asked Regal with a dryness that made men laugh as if it had been an actual joke. Regal made a sound that was less like a yes than like the knowledge that the answer did not matter. He had his own plans. Viserion lowered his head and bumped the shoulder of a man who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite last winter. The man laughed. Everything that lived wanted to be seen. Daenerys put her hand on Drogon and then on Viserion and then on Regal in turn. She did not whisper anything to them. She had learned that saying words to dragons taught the speaker more than the dragons learned. She sent instead the shape of her intention. It was a thing like a ribbon in clear water. They tugged on it like cats. Jon Snow took his leave with a briefness that did not wound. It was the brevity of a man who had trained himself to stand too long in farewells and had learned that both the standing and the sorrow gnawed his energy. He nodded to Wyman. He looked into Missandei's face as if he were asking her to watch where his line crossed hers. He looked at Daenerys and did not tell her to be careful, because he had understood what kind of uselessness that would be. "Do not fall in love with the cold," he said instead. "It will not love you back." "I have never made it a habit to fall in love with anything that thinks it is a god," she said. "Then we will get on." They went out under the gate with the flayed man's standards nowhere in sight because someone had thought better of sending that insult anywhere near her and anything that could easily combust. The dragon wings beat. The wolf loped. Men in black swore cheerfully because their blood moved for once and did not slouch in their veins like a hound by a fire. She stood until they passed beyond the last outer wall and became black beads on a white thread, and then she went to the lighthouse again, who knows why, because the height made the world's choices clearer, because the dragons loved it, because when her mind was too loud she needed the wind to push it back into shape. There she found Willa with her fists jammed under her armpits to warm them and her chin up because she had not yet learned the posture of women who have decided not to attract gods. "Is it true your hair is not yellow but white because of a magic?" the child asked as if they had been in the middle of a longer conversation. "It is true my father's father had hair this color and his mother's mother did too," Daenerys said. "And it is true I stood in a place once where fire taught me something." "What did it teach you?" "That it wants everything," Willa considered. "And ice wants everything too," she said. "So between them there is very little left for people." "People are stubborn," Daenerys said. "They will find a piece of ground no one can name and lay their blankets on it and eat and sing anyway." Willa nodded and for a moment older than herself looked out at the city. "We will make you a pie when the sheep are lambing," she said in the careful voice of a child who keys the offer to a calendar she has learned from women. "I will learn to make it. And if you come back from where you go and you can still taste, you will tell us how we did." "I will," Daenerys said, and watched the dragons reduce themselves to lines and then to dots and then to nothing in a north that seemed to lean down to take them into its coat. That night she woke with the sense, not of danger, but of an old vastness opening its eye. She lay in the dark and listened to a snow sound that was not snow, the dry brush of flakes against the shutters, the periodic small thump where some accumulation slid off a sill. Somewhere a drunk sang of the sea and his voice cracked like ice around the words. Missandei breathed with the patience of a woman who makes her own order. In the distance a dragon shifted and it was like a house settling. She looked at the ceiling where the firelight did not reach and saw water moving behind wood, a faint light under ice, a shape that was not a shape but a pressure. She thought of the men of the north and their gods, of a tree with a face carved in it by hands that believed knives had prayers in them. She had chosen in many places what to believe, had chosen, more importantly, what not to dismiss. Somewhere far out there the dead counted. Somewhere nearer the living counted as well. She fixed her attention on places where bread would be needed tomorrow. She thought about how to persuade Wyman to send men up the river to break the skin when it formed. She thought about the boy with the missing finger teaching the Dothraki to listen to ice. In the days that followed, White Harbor leaned into the art of keeping. Men stood in water to their thighs knocking at ice to keep the channel open for as long as possible and came out of it with their legs purple and their teeth chattering and the buckets of heated stones waiting for them. Women turned worn cloth into new with small rage. Children learned to walk with care on paths strewn with chopped switches. The unsullied practiced in the open space behind a tannery, and each day they allowed one more northern boy to watch from the proper distance. When that boy tried to imitate the movements later, a soldier would correct his grip and the boy would pretend not to set the knowledge next to his heart like a jewel. Tyrion found a corner in a baker's shop where the oven made his bones loose and the baker's daughter made him give up more coins than he intended for the tiny buns baked with dried apples in them. He watched the door and listened and measured. He made a private list of men who would change the city when spring came and of those who would try to change it now and had to be watched to see whether they were wise or cruel. He wrote a letter to a banker in a city that believed in numbers more than in gods and used a cipher that would make the letter look like a merchant arguing about barrel staves. He bought the singer a new glove and said, "Learn a second song in which a queen refuses to be dissuaded without pride." The singer nodded solemnly and went out and wrote a ridiculous melody that made women cry over their stitching and men roll their eyes as they drank because they were not yet ready to admit they could be moved. Ser Marlin showed Grey Worm the hidden places of the city, because even honest men like to have honest secrets. There were tunnels dug where smuggling had kept families alive under men who had called smuggling a sin until they needed smuggled salt to keep their fish alive. There were caches of wood that would be needed if the first caches were discovered by those who hoard. There was a way to send a tiny boat down a cut in the river and past the ice when it came that could save a life. Grey Worm measured every step and did not tell the northern man how it pulled at him to be trusted by someone whose whole life had taught him that trust was a short rope. Missandei taught the women who wanted to learn how to count without chalk and to keep tallies with knotted cords. She taught the smallest ones words in a language from a harbor far away, and they wore the strange sounds like beads. She set up a table in the hall and taught letters to anyone who came and allowed the men to pretend they had come to correct their sons when they had come to learn the letters themselves. Some nights Daenerys stood in the doorway and watched a 10-year-old teach her father and did not go in because even Yuns have no place in certain miracles. On the 9th day, a raven came again from the north. This one had ice on its beak and blood on its feet that was not its own. It sat on the new castle's roof with its head out and its eyes clever and furious. The leather band around its leg was stiff as bone. The message, printed more hurriedly than last time, said, "The dead moved last night. We hold. Send." And it did not say send what. It assumed she would know. It assumed that a person who could bring down a dragon from the sky with a gesture would not be confused about what it meant to be needed. She stood at the lighthouse again at dusk, because sunset had become a liturgy for her on these cold days. Heat out of the sky, then the quick collapse into night. The ice at the mouth of the river moved as if a giant's hand were pressing under it and letting go. The harbor breathed. Everything that lived in it breathed with it. The 1,000 people who had been convinced by simple things that fear and hope are not mutually exclusive. The dragon that slept with its head on its own arm like a child. The woman who had told her about the thing watching at the river bend and had gone home and made her child chew fat for longer than he wanted to because she knew what winter took first. The man who had offered to walk to Winterfell with a message and whom Wyman had refused because there are some partial braveries that do not need to be satisfied when they cost too much. She lifted her hand. Drogon woke the way mountains wake, slowly and then entirely. Regal turned his head on the lighthouse ledge and his eye showed her a sky in which a woman flew toward a horizon that would refuse to come closer. Viserion unfurled and shook himself and snow fell in a sheet off his wing. They came to her great and simple as tides. She breathed and felt them breathe. "Go," she said, and this time she used the word. She did not call by name. She did not bind them. She simply opened a path every instinct in them had been pressing against. Find Jon Snow. Find the wind he walks in. Make a space for him to stand. She did not say come back. She believed they would. She believed nothing. She did both at once. She watched them go, their shadows briefly painting the harbor white, then swallowed by a gray that had been sharpening into indifference all afternoon. Behind her, the child Willa had come up the steps without being heard, her tiny breath going in and out like a drum that keeps a different rhythm from the drums men use to praise their gods. Daenerys did not turn. She watched the north take what she had sent. She thought for a quiet, ugly moment of how easy it had been for men to make her the shape of every hope they had right up until the point where she had to choose which hope to fulfill first. She smiled into the wind at herself, and put her hand against the stone where it was coldest and let it take some of her heat and did not demand it back. White Harbor waited then with the kind of waiting that becomes work. Men went down to the piers and checked the ties. Women smoothed blankets and hung them near fires for others than their own. Tyrion stood with Wyman at a window and made a plan that spent coin in a way that would keep a crew of river men busy and too proud to take money called charity. Missandei wrote a letter to a city she had left with a promise and made the letter sound like a cord thrown from a deck to a small boat. Grey Worm set a rotation of watch that ran from the wolf's den to the outer wall and made it so that no man walked alone if he was not the kind of man who needed to be alone. Snow fell. It gathered on the dragon's ledges, on the lighthouse brazier hood, on the shoulders of the statue at the harbor that had lost its nose to a storm 70 years ago and wore the injury like a piece of jewelry. It sifted into the cracks in the stone where old mortar had pulled away and sat there like a council of small ghosts. The cold pressed and then drew back on the 11th day as if it had changed its mind. The city breathed a little easier. Children went out and threw themselves into the snow on purpose and laughed. A man who owned a bellows went from door to door offering to use it to draw smoke up chimneys that had grown sulky. The bakers baked 2 more loaves than usual and made the bread smaller so it would seem there was more. And on the 12th day, before dawn had decided whether to climb out of its own bed, a sound came from the north that was not the wind and not the sea and not the cry of a living thing. Crossed the ice like an insult. It rattled shutters. It made the horses in their stalls strike out at their doors. Daenerys stood with her cloak half-fastened and did not move to finish it because sudden and absolute she felt Drogon in the air and Regal in the wildness and Viserion in a place strange to him. The feeling of a creature going faster than his own thought and catching up to it and then outrunning it again. She wanted to run for the lighthouse at once. She wanted to call and call. She did neither. She stood where she was, and the city stood with her because no one knew how to move when the air remembered a language it had not spoken for centuries. Then there, on the road from the north, came shapes. Men first, small and reducing the distance slowly, and then with haste when the gate guard had sense enough to pull the bar before anyone asked if they should. The men were from the wall, and there were fewer of them than had gone out, and they held up a man whose left hand bled too much for the cold to own it yet. And behind them, above them, tall, unstoppable, the dragons, all 3, coming in low with frost smoking off their wings, and one of them, Regal, screamed once in a way that made every man and woman in White Harbor understand that whatever had tasted him near the wall would not be allowed to taste him again without paying in a currency that the world had almost forgotten it kept. "Open," Daenerys said, and did not recognize her own voice. It was so steady. It was a road laid through winter. "Open and do not ask questions." They poured into the courtyard. Men fell and rose and fell and were gathered. Jon Snow came through behind the first of them, pale with the cold and with a streak of blood on his cheek where a branch had remembered it still had sharpness. The wolf went before him and did not look left or right. He stood under the lintel and lifted his face to find her. He did not smile. He did something like it with his eyes. Later, there would be hours of telling and measuring. There would be men with fingers missing. There would be a boy with a voice lost for a while and then found again when it remembered his lungs. There would be a story about a lake that had always been a lake and had decided for one night that it would be a mouth. There would be a ragged piece of cloth with a symbol burnt into it that made Wyman Manderly sit down and breathe as if the room lacked air. There would be a conversation between Tyrion and Jon Snow so dry you could have lit tinder with it. There would be a woman who had never before in her life touched a dragon, and who would carry the shape of that touch in her hand to her grave. But in that first breath of return, there was only this. Daenerys stepping down into the space she had made a space for, and Jon Snow stopping 3 feet from her, as if he had come to the edge of a cliff and recognizing that beyond was air that would hold him if he set his foot into it. He did not reach for her. She did not reach for him. The dragons lowered their heads until the courtyard was all breath and heat and ice melting and being remade. The wolf did not move. The city breathed in. The city breathed out. "Your promise," Jon Snow said finally, voice rough from a cold he had swallowed. "You sent it." "I keep what I send," she said. And in the slow drift of falling snow that had grown fine and steady, the 2 of them stood and let winter write their silhouettes into a city that would have to decide whether it loved fire more than it feared it. The decision would not be swift. It would not be pure. It would not be anything as simple as stories made it. It would hold. It would change. It would leave room for other stories to be written in the margins. She did not know then that the envoy from Winterfell would come again with a different tone in his voice and a woman behind him who had learned to hide fury in her hands, or that Tyrion would learn to play dice on ice without falling, or that Missandei would teach the singing of numbers to a man with gaps in his teeth until he cried to find his mouth could still hold music. She did not know that a thin boy in the tannery yard would stitch together the skin on a dragon's shoulder with a thread made for sails and grow old remembering that stitch until it kept him from sleeping or saved him from madness, depending on the year. She knew only that she had arrived in a place that required slow work and that the slow work had begun. Snow fell. Men carried fire with care. The sea moved as if the world beneath it shifted its weight. Somewhere in all that shifting, the north made a small space where a woman with silver hair and dragons might stand without apology. That space would have to be defended anew every dawn. but for now it was there, and the sight of it was something she let herself look at and not look away from, as if the horizon had finally kept its promise and shown her a line that did not recede.